Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to talk about something I mentioned in my review of episode 4 of Star Trek Picard when I complained about that scene in which Picard was in a holographic simulation of his house and he told the program to freeze, and we see the birds outside the window frozen in the sky, and yet inside the room we see the fireplace and the fire is still moving, still burning. And someone mentioned in the comment section that there was a similar mistake in an episode of TNG called The Defector. In the beginning of that episode we see that and Picard in the holodeck. And by the way, something funny in that scene is that Patrick Stewart actually played one of those holographic characters. I always found that part kind of funny. I wonder what is the in-universe explanation for that. Did Picard ask the program to make it based on him or what? So that's always kind of funny. And at some point Data tells the computer to freeze the program, and we see these holographic characters freeze in place, and yet there's a campfire near them and it keeps moving, it keeps burning despite the program being frozen. And so I guess the new show Star Trek Picard actually got it right, because it actually does fit that older scene. And this is exactly the kind of stuff I always make up excuses for, invent theories to try to explain it. Now, before anyone tells me, oh, so now you're defending it because it was in TNG, so it was okay in TNG. No, I would have complained about it as well if I was making a review of TNG. I would have said the exact same thing. Now, the difference with TNG, because TNG was such a good show overall, even though it did have a whole bunch of stupid episodes and a lot of stupid moments and stupid scenes, but it had much more good stuff in it compared to the bad stuff. And so in the big picture it was still a very good show, and for that reason whenever I do encounter stuff like that in the shows that I like, that's why I invent theories to explain it. So this is a perfect example. It's something we can easily explain away. We can simply say that the holodeck is programmed to freeze characters of people and animals whenever someone says to hold the program. All the background things like the sun in the sky obviously will not stop shining, so it's obviously still kind of burning, still working. And maybe the clouds in the sky will keep moving because it's simply part of the scenery, it's simply something in the background. And so I guess we can simply say that the fireplace or the campfire is part of the scenery and not the character, and that's why it doesn't freeze when someone tells the program to hold. And it actually fit a lot of stuff we saw in other episodes. For example, one time Picard was playing that detective in the holodeck and he wanted to just relax and rest in there because he was hiding from Loxana Troy, I think, and so he had all those annoying characters showing up wanting to kill him all the time. And at some point he simply froze all the characters and then sat down to relax. And the chair he was sitting on was obviously still moving, was still functioning, and so we can say that all the scenery inside the holodeck remains the same and only the characters get frozen. So I think that kind of solves it. Now, another way to explain it is that some of the material in the holodeck might actually be a real material. That's actually something they told us in the early seasons of TNG. They always said that the holodeck actually creates some of the material inside it, like a replicator. And that's why we sometimes saw people walking out wet from inside the holodeck and the water is dripping down to the floor and them having to wipe it off, or a snowball flying out of the holodeck, and in some cases even objects like a piece of paper. And Picard was once kissed by a lady inside the holodeck and he walked out with lipstick still on him. So that's how it was in the early TNG. That's how they explained the holodeck being so good, so realistic, because it actually replicated some of the material inside it for you to be able to actually feel it because it's real material. And in the first episode of TNG, that actually said it specifically. He said much of this is real, and he even demonstrated it when he picked up a rock and he threw it against the wall and it hit the wall, which is actually kind of a mistake because shouldn't the holodeck simulate it as if the rock is flying beyond the wall? So shouldn't it replace the real rock with projection on the wall? So it's kind of a continuity mistake. Now maybe Data simply threw it so hard or so quickly that the computer was not able to do it in time. Maybe back then holodecks were still glitchy, it was still possible to fool the holodeck, and later on they fixed this problem. They did mention them getting upgrades in season 1 of TNG because of all their malfunctions in the holodeck, and so we can assume that they kind of tinkered with it and improved it. And because there was an episode when Picard himself was hit in the face with a snowball from inside the holodeck, maybe after that incident he spoke to the technicians and told them, I don't want anything to ever leave the door of the holodeck again. And that can explain how come in later seasons objects disappear the moment you throw them out of the door. They don't really go out. And I'm guessing the people inside the holodeck were never made from real stuff. They were probably pure projections, because you cannot create a living organic matter even with a replicator. It's actually been mentioned a few times that a replicator is not able to create living cells, and it's not able to create complex biological materials. It's been said specifically by Dr. Crusher in that episode when I needed a transfusion for a Romulan. She said the replicator cannot create it, the molecules are too complex. And other times they said they cannot replicate certain materials because it takes too much power or it will take too long. So the replicator cannot actually create anything. And so all the people we see in the holodeck are probably pure projections, just force fields and photons, as it was described later in Deep Space Nine and in Star Trek Insurrections. They actually said that the holodeck is basically just force fields and photons. That's a pure illusion. They never said again that it's a real material inside there. Maybe they just didn't mention that, but in the early TNG they did say specifically that a lot of the material inside the holodeck is actually replicated. And it actually does make sense because that can explain how you can eat stuff in the holodeck, and it's not risky to go out of the holodeck after you ate something inside, because let's say it's just force fields and photons, and you eat something and then you leave the holodeck, then that something disappears from inside your stomach and creates a vacuum, so that might be very risky if you ate a lot of food inside it, and suddenly you have a pocket of a vacuum, or maybe even energy coming out inside your stomach, and so that's probably not so healthy for you. So most likely when you eat something inside the holodeck, it actually creates it with replicator technology, it creates real food. I think we even have evidence for this in the season 7 episode Emergence, when they were drinking something inside the holodeck simulation and then the program ended, and yet they were still holding those glasses with the drink. So that kind of indicates that those glasses with the drinks were actually replicated for them, so that they'll be able to drink it for real and leave the holodeck with it without any problems in the stomach. So it actually makes sense, and so that can explain all those continuity contradictions when people walked out of the holodeck with a piece of paper, for example. And so we can also presume that maybe whenever we see a fire in the holodeck, maybe it's actually burning real material that was replicated, maybe for extra realism. I still find it kind of fishy, because why would the holodeck create something potentially dangerous like a fire which can burn you? If there are safeties in the holodeck, then shouldn't all forms of fire be just a simulation that cannot really burn you? And so that's why it still kind of bugs me. So that's why I prefer my previous explanation of it being simply the settings of the holodeck, so that if it's part of the scenery, it will keep burning even if you freeze the characters. I think that explanation is better, but I could also accept the second explanation of maybe the real material is still burning because it's actually replicated material inside the holodeck, and maybe, you know, the smoke is cleared immediately by the room itself, and so that's why you don't inhale any smoke and so on. So I don't really have a problem with this mistake anymore, because at least it was consistent with what we saw before on TNG. And so I think they might have unintentionally got things right by making the same mistake the second time, basically. I doubt someone actually paid attention and got it right deliberately. I think most likely this was a mistake, but it actually fit the same mistake that was in TNG, and so we can only come up with excuses to explain it. And so I prefer the explanation that it's simply part of the scenery, and the scenery doesn't disappear and doesn't change its function if you freeze the characters. And as for the holographic material inside the holodeck, I think it actually would make sense, because since they do have replicator technology, then why not do it? Like, why not have the whole holodeck be like a giant replicator and have some of the material appear there for real, and then you can interact with it much better. It will feel like real material because it actually is. Except for people, I guess, which is why Picard was not lying to Moriarty when he told him you cannot leave this room, because people are made purely from photons and force fields, and they don't have any real material, unlike more inanimate objects which can sometimes leave the holodeck, at least in the first seasons, before Picard told someone to change it because he doesn't want to get hit in the face with another snowball ever. And maybe that's why they reprogrammed the holodeck to not allow objects to leave it if you throw it out of the door. Another indication that holographic people were not made from any real mass was in that episode of season 1 with those gangsters, when some of them walked a few steps out of the door, and then they started disappearing, but their legs disappeared first, and yet they didn't fall to the floor. They basically were floating in mid-air as they were disappearing, so that seems to indicate they didn't have any real weight to them, that gravity was not affecting them, and therefore we can assume they were never made from any kind of real mass, and only certain objects were. Even though it's kind of strange that Picard once kissed a holographic woman, and then her lipstick stayed on him, and then later on Beverly Crusher noticed it, and that embarrassed Picard. Maybe that's also one of the reasons that Picard ordered someone to redesign the holodeck features so that it will not allow anything to leave the holodeck, because otherwise you might embarrass yourself if you leave the holodeck with something from the holodeck still on you. And I won't give any specific examples of what I'm thinking of, because I don't want YouTube to give me strikes, but you can imagine the kind of stuff that might happen accidentally if you leave the holodeck in a hurry and you don't clean up, and then something from the simulation is still on you, that might be very embarrassing. So that kind of stuff always happened to Picard, and since he's the captain, then it makes sense for him to demand that the holodeck is changed so that nothing leaves from it. And that's why when he later was throwing books out of the door, it disappeared immediately. Even though I do wish they would have still acknowledged the kind of explanation I just provided of some of the material in the holodeck still being real. Also, it would explain all kinds of strange lines that wouldn't work otherwise. I think one time Picard told Riker that he could use a vacation inside the holodeck. He said something like fresh holographic air will do you good or something like that, and it wouldn't really make any sense if it's purely force fields and photons, but it might make sense if the air itself is replicated with some kind of healthy features. So all kinds of little lines like that seems to indicate that the holodeck is actually creating some of the materials inside it, even in the later seasons, and simply someone reconfigured it so that no material will leave the door. Now, I wish some of this was addressed in the episode The Ship in a Bottle, in which they specifically talked about removing objects from the holodeck, and they even tried to beam it out of the holodeck. And they said it's impossible because all the objects in the holodeck are not made from real matter, and that seemed to contradict what I just was talking about, examples from the previous seasons. And so I wish they would have said that some objects can be removed because they are actually replicated inside, and only people cannot be removed. So I wish they would have actually used that episode to explain away all those previous contradictions, but instead they just went with a new method of everything just being force fields and photons, and nothing in there being real. And as for the issue of transporters, that's also an interesting question, because technically if you are able to teleport someone with a transporter by breaking him up into energy and then reassembling him, then technically you should be able to replicate people as well, because it seems to be like the same principle as the replicator. But I guess the explanation is, as I said previously, a replicator cannot create complex matter, it cannot create living cells, and therefore it's impossible to replicate people. And a transporter, I guess, doesn't really break it up fully, it simply somehow pushes that material to some kind of different phase, but still in the same pattern, and then you're able to beam it to a distant location, and then it reassembles itself. And it might be easier to do because it doesn't really break you fully. And we actually saw in one episode Barclay was being transported, and he was fully conscious throughout the whole process. There was never a moment in which his consciousness was shut off, so he never saw blackness. He always saw himself being teleported as if he's whole. So that seems to indicate that it doesn't really break you up completely. It simply puts you into kind of a different phase, maybe partially breaks you down, but it keeps you in the same kind of pattern, and then you rematerialize back to normal, but you are never fully broken up. Otherwise you would lose consciousness while you're transporting. And maybe that's why it's impossible to save someone's pattern and simply recreate a person from the last pattern, because you don't have enough storage space to store someone's full pattern. It only kind of, you're able to store it temporarily in the transporter buffer itself, but you cannot do it endlessly with a lot of people. They did have a few episodes with that kind of stuff being done, but I'm guessing it cannot be done on large scale, that's what I'm saying. And you cannot create a person from scratch just from energy. You do have to have the real person that you're beaming. The only example of a person being replicated was in the episode Second Chances, when we met the second Riker, who did kind of get replicated by a transporter malfunction, but I guess that was all because of that special atmosphere of that unique planet, and so it's not something that can usually be done. It's something impossible usually, which only happened as a 1 in a million chance of an accident, and so it's not something that is normally possible, at least for humans. Maybe some more advanced aliens are able to do it, as was implied in the episode Allegiance, in which those aliens said that they are able to replicate complex material, even neurons of brains. That's why they can make copies of people and all of that, but it's not possible for Starfleet yet. And it's a good thing, because that would be a very overpowered ability. If they can just replicate people, basically, it would mean that death is no longer a problem, and so on. So that would be a storytelling problem if you have this kind of ability. And that's why whenever we do see such stuff, it's always some kind of unique accident that it's impossible to recreate. Another problem is in that episode when they all turn into children and then they use the transporter to fix themselves. That also is a little problematic, because it seems to indicate that you can use the transporter to live forever. If you can simply make yourself younger with the transporter, then why don't everybody do it? But again, I'm guessing that was only possible under those unique conditions near that unique anomaly. Still, it would beg the question, why don't more ships arrive to that unique anomaly or to that unique planet with a unique atmosphere and simply use it to replicate things which cannot normally be replicated? So it still begs the question, why everybody forgot about it, but in the normal episodes I think it's safe to assume it's impossible to replicate anything you want, it's impossible to replicate people, and similarly it's impossible to create artificial people inside the holodeck who can leave the holodeck. And only simple objects can leave because it's easy to replicate them. And this also explains why something as complex as the Android data also couldn't be replicated, because that was said specifically that Maddox is unable to make more datas without studying data's exact structure, and maybe later he will be able to replicate such a technology. So this seems to indicate that it's impossible to replicate complex materials, and that even though he's artificial, he's still made from very complex structures, just as complex as living organic materials, and that's why it's not easy to replicate androids like data. You have to duplicate the exact science that is able to create structures like his brain and so on. So I think overall everything fits. We can explain all of this away. So I hope it's been enjoyable to listen to. Let me know what you think and we can discuss it in the comments below. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.